The month of October, I guess Christian bookstores came up with it, is kind of a pastor's appreciation thing, and we appreciate it. Man, I tell you what, I have never eaten this many cookies in a month in my life, and we've had some lunches and very much blessing. Appreciate that very much. You know, I just say this from my vantage point. We got a very very good staff. And let me just say this about our staff. We are friends. You know, that's a huge deal. I'm a big believer that if you're going to work with somebody, you're going to serve with somebody, you better be friends with them. So we are friends first and foremost. One of the things I keep telling our staff is that you are the number one chief feet washers. You've got to be the number one feet washers. We're not here to lord over anybody. We're here to serve. Jesus said, I did not come to be served, but to serve and to give my life as a ransom for many. If that's what Jesus said, then we better be modeling that as service. So we talk about that. But I want you to know something about our staff. And the reason I say staff is because there are certain of us that have titles pastor, but that is good. But we have a whole staff, whether it's off staff, ministerial staff, our spouse's involvement. I can say this about our staff. You can find better, more talented people, but I tell you what, character and integrity are huge with me. And so you will not find a better group of just character and integrity from Brandon, who handles our facilities, all the way through the ladies in the office, through the pastoral staff. So I just stand up here and say thank you. And then right behind that is, you know, a couple of weeks ago, I've been talking about the election situation. And I know certain people want their pastor to get up and tell them how to vote or tell them what the major issues are and these kind of things. And I could do that, but I just hadn't felt led to do that currently because I'm hearing so many things being said of fear. And it just makes me wonder what has happened. And then I've come to this conclusion. You know, God knows that every 4 years we're going to have an election. And I think he just uses, I believe that God is a God who uses everything for his glory. And he even let his people be taken into Babylon. If you're reading in Jeremiah right now, in the year reading, he let his people be taken into Babylon so that his name would not be forgotten, so he'd be brought glory. He's fulfilling everything in Jesus and history. And so I believe that he knows every 4 years is coming. He's awakening in his church. It's time to wake up. You need to pray. You need to get on your faces, seek me. And so I believe that. But I was reading something. You remember a couple of weeks ago I told you from God's word in 2 Chronicles 7:14, it kind of gives a recipe for revival there. When plagues come, when rain stops up, it says, if my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray, seek my face, turn from their wicked ways, then from heaven will I hear, forgive their sins, and heal their land. That's what it says in 2 Chronicles 7:14. And we talked about that, and I thought, man, that's great, until I saw another thing that really hit me between the eyes as your pastor. And it was in the book of Joel. Don't go there because this isn't part of the message yet. This is for free. But I was reading in Joel, and I read this in Joel. It was a time where Joel is given this prophecy, and he talks about how the locusts have come in and eaten everything, and how it's a time of despair and this kind of stuff. And then he says this. He says, put on sackcloth, you priest, and mourn. Wail, you who minister before the altar. Come spend the night in sackcloth, you who minister before my God. For the grain offerings and drink offerings are withheld from the house of your God. Declare a holy fast, call a solemn assembly. Summon the elders and all who live in the land to the house of the Lord your God, and cry out to the Lord. Now, I read that and I realized that's an Old Testament prophecy. It's talking about priests in the temple and all this kind of stuff. But yet you can't help but read that and know that he's talking about those who are in spiritual leadership. He's saying, you in spiritual leadership, when things get bad, what you need to be doing is you need to be on your face crying out to me. And he even says mourning, weeping unto me, seeking me when things get tough. And so it's easy for me to get up here and say, if my people, you better be praying, you better be repenting, you better be seeking the face of God. Then all of a sudden, what does God do? He sticks the mirror up in front of me and says, if you're going to spiritually lead these people, Mark, you better be on your face mourning and weeping and seeking and crying after me. And so I thought, man, you want to be a leader, you better understand what God calls of a leader. And we're in those days where, it's time for spiritual leaders to arise. It's time for the church to awaken. I mean, we look at so many things. I want you to turn with me to 2 Timothy chapter 3 just a moment. And I just want to spend a couple of minutes on this, and then the worship team is going to come back, and we're going to just prepare our hearts before we take the Lord's Supper. But Paul, the Apostle Paul, is writing a letter to Timothy. Timothy is the pastor of a church in Ephesus, okay? So he is writing him, and he is giving him instruction. And 1 Timothy and 2 Timothy, both of them deal very much with what's happening in the church. So I want you to understand, this is in the church. This isn't talking about the world so much as the church. And in 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 1, he says this, "But mark this," in other words, keep this in front of you. "There will be terrible times in the last days. People will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boastful, proud, abusive, disobedient to their parents, ungrateful, unholy, without love, unforgiving, slanderous, without self-control, brutal, not lovers of the good, treacherous, rash, conceited, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, having a form of godliness but denying its power, have nothing to do with such people." What Paul is saying to Timothy is listen, Timothy, I'm not just talking about the world here. I'm talking about this stuff is going to creep into the church. And when he says the last times, people wonder, Mark, is he talking about right before Jesus comes back? The answer to that is yes. But you got to understand, these people were looking for Jesus to come back at any day. They had a greater expectation than you and I do. They were looking for him to come back at any moment. And he is saying, listen, in the last times, you're going to see these things come about. And you know what? If I read that list, and if I were to go get in the latest newspaper, and I would see those things side by side, I would start seeing, and you know as well as I do, you start seeing these things. And he's saying these things are going to creep into the church. He said, there's going to be terrible times, is what he says. That literally means the only other time that Greek word is used in the New Testament was to describe the two demoniac guys who were in the tombstones, among the tombstones, living among the tombstones. He said that they were in a terrible situation. So he is describing our day as one that's perilous, one that's raging, one that is out of control, and he describes that. And let's look at these. I'm not going to walk through all of them, but look in verse 2 there. He says, first of all, people will be lovers of themselves. Literally, that is, if you were to have a funnel, and a funnel has a small end and a big end, it's like that one thing, lovers of themselves, leads to all of these other things. Okay? It just leads there. Hang on just a second. That's your phone. Sorry. It's going off in my pocket and I don't want to answer. Okay. Kids ought to be in church today. Oh, there they are. Okay. Never mind. All's good. All's good. But that lovers of self is the small end of the funnel that, the other things, what you would almost call, I guess what Kirk Herbstreit would say is the cesspool of things that happen out of that. And that's what we see here in these. And so it's that lovers of self. And you're thinking, do we really love ourselves that much? Oh, yeah. In fact, sociologists and people that study cultures would say that the current culture in the United States of America is by far the most egotistical group of people that have ever lived on this planet. And you're saying, how can they really say that? Think about it. I love it when Francis Chan says this. He says, you think that's not true, but he says, we are the only culture in the world that believes that the most important thing on the internet is a page about ourselves. And then we only put up what's the most important stuff, right? So there's this comparative thing that comes in here. We start feeling less than because your pictures are better. Your family looks more beautiful than mine. And at home, yours is falling apart. But on Facebook, they look great. But what we look at here is how there's this lovers of self. And then it goes on to talk about other things, the love of money, boastful, proud, abusive, disobedient to their parents. Isn't that interesting that that's in there? But this has really become a huge issue. And I appreciate Alan and the youth ministers in town putting together this parenting conference that's coming up, I think next week, that you're able to get some, especially if you have teenagers, to help you in that time, because we live in a time where that's happening. I want to draw attention to a couple here. Look at the first part of verse 3. It says, without love. Now that seems like a strange thing, because we always love, doesn't it seem? I love food. I love my family. It seems like those things are natural. But what this is literally saying is that there is going to come a time when people do not have a natural affection. It will be without natural affection. They will give their affections to other things, but that which God created as the natural is not going to be the course anymore. Do you not see these things slipping in? But he's saying these things are going to slip into the church. One other one here, he says they will be lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God. This hedonism that's going to sneak in. I'm not making this stuff up. This is what Paul told Timothy years ago, and we see this all the time. I want to look at one other one. Look at verse 5. He says, having a form of godliness, but denying its power. Having a form of godliness. In other words, having the expression on the outside. You see this? It's an expression. Inside is hollow, but man, we're putting up a good front that we look pretty religious. We look pretty much okay. And this is the case. I mean, to see across the world, churches just emptying and what is happening there. And we see that Paul told Timothy about these things years ago. He said, this is going to happen in latter times. I want you to know something, though. A couple of weeks ago, I talked to you about when Thomas Jefferson and John Adams ran for president in the late 1790s, and how that it was such a rough time in our nation. I want to back up to that just a second, not to bore you, but I think it's interesting to know that when people start looking at our current presidential election, they start looking at the moral decay of our nation, they start looking at this loving of self and this self-absorption that we have in our culture, that we start looking at that and we're thinking, has it ever been this way before, or is this the worst it's ever going to be? Let me tell you, this isn't the worst it's ever been. In the 1730s and 1740s, just to go back in our history before we were even a nation, there was a great awakening that happened in this nation, or in this country. Jonathan Edwards, you may remember in his preaching, there was a great awakening. I mean, God was moving. But what happened is by the time we entered into war with Great Britain and came out of that, and on the other side of that, after that lengthy battle, and we had won our independence, by that time, things had started to decay in our nation. Great Britain obviously removed themselves until we come back into the War of 1812, but they had removed themselves, and with them removing themselves, our country was on the verge of bankruptcy all the time. Our economy was tubing. In fact, our sailing vessels could not even hardly leave to go anywhere without being, because before that had Great Britain to protect them, that was no longer the case. They could not even make it out. There was terrorist threats on all sides, from France, from other places could come in. And there was this fear that somebody's going to take over, very much beyond what we fear of ISIS or some kind of situation like that today. This was the situation in our nation. So people could no longer go that route to trade. So they tried another route, only to run into, they say, were pirates who were from Muslim countries who would come and just take the ships. And so our economy was tanking, and bankruptcy was tanking, and this was the situation in our country. But not only that, but in France, the Age of Enlightenment was coming in. And with the Age of Enlightenment, this starts to come into the United States, especially into college campuses. And what they discovered is these places like Harvard and Yale, Princeton, these places that were built for the instruction of people to preach the gospel, this Age of Enlightenment came in, and the college campuses, you couldn't find any young people that were following Jesus. In fact, they were saying that the age of just this selfish sensuality just was entering into college campuses on a rapid pace. You couldn't even find Christians on the campuses at that time. But not only that, but because of that, churches were just emptying. People were just leaving the church. There was no spiritual roots. In fact, the only thing that was really growing at the time was this Unitarian Universalist movement, which is, if you know anything about Unitarian Universalists, it just says that all people are going to heaven, right? I mean, everybody's good, everybody's going to heaven. It's almost like the funerals you go to in our day that nobody wants to tell the truth that person probably didn't know Christ, is spending an eternity separated from God, but yet that's the truth according to God's word. But yet this Unitarian viewpoint was just coming in to the nation. So the nation was bankrupt on a moral capacity. It was bankrupt on its finances. It was bankrupt on how it could protect itself at that time. The political scene was just into this mudslinging and all this kind of stuff. That's the way they were at the time. We look at it even more is that there was actually natural plagues that were hitting the country at that time. I mean, we were in a moral, political, economical, bankrupt time as a nation. But God always comes through. He had a remnant of people who started to pray because they started looking back in the 1730s. Why did they have a great awakening? And what they discovered is there was always a group of people who were crying out for God. And so they started to develop prayer circles in certain areas, and they began to cry out unto God. They began to pray. And then they started having what was called sacraments. Now, I know some of you grew up in churches that had what you call sacraments, maybe the Catholic Church. Many of you would say, well, communion is a sacrament. But these sacraments were weekend experiences that they would have. People would travel to go to certain areas. They would start on a Friday. They would go Friday, Saturday, and Sunday is how they normally go. But these are people crying out for God. And this is a time when we are starved as a nation spiritually, okay? So what happens is, let me just tell you about one of these, and this is what took place. It was called the Canes Ridge revival that took place. Cane Ridge, Kentucky. In 1801, around that time is when it took place. But what happened, it was one of these sacrament weekends. What they did is you don't know, the word just got out. Canes Ridge was not very big, but they say between 25 and 30,000 people showed up in this little nook of a place in 1801. What happens in a sacrament is this, is that on the first day, Friday, people start doing self-examination because they're going to take the Lord's Supper on Sunday. This is one of the reasons I make sure on Thursday, we're taking the Lord's Supper today. Now, if my emails become white noise, go get it out of spam because it helps sometimes. And so what happened is these people showed up on Friday and they started doing personal introspection. In other words, has my faith grown dry? Have I got sin against somebody? Am I in a broken relationship? Is my motives, not just my actions, but are my motives not geared towards the Lord the way they need to be? So it was a time of introspection. And then this is what happened on Saturday. Because so many people came in, they had pastors all there. And on Saturday, the pastors would go from family to family to family and just sit down with them and one-on-one just start talking to them about where their walk with Jesus Christ was. They did that all day on Saturday so that Sunday, when they came to the Lord's table, they knew they were prayed up, they had dealt with the sin in their life, they had dealt with that stuff that wasn't of God, the relationships, so that they could come to God and with a pure heart around the table, okay? And we take a song. But they would do this. Now, at Canes Ridge, what happened was, I already told you that people are hungry for God. They're starting to cry out to God. They're seeing the bankruptcy of our nation. Morally, spiritually, economically, it's going down the tubes. These people are crying out to God. And at Canes Ridge, Kentucky, these 25 to 30,000 people come, and they're so hungry for God that by the time they get to the Lord's Supper on Sunday, God just poured himself out in an incredible way. And what happened is it's become known as the American Pentecost. It was the second great awakening that swept through our nation. What happened there at Canes Ridge happened in these other sacrament movements. And what happened is the gospel began to spread throughout our nation at that point. And revival literally took place. Now, somebody's going to say, hey, are we morally, spiritually, economically bankrupt in our country? I'll let you answer that question. I think we're pretty close. The question that is there a remnant that's crying out to God? Is there people that are willing to cry out to God and say, God, we need you? Coming around this table, sometimes we have a tendency, and I'm as guilty as anybody, is to come flippantly. And I'm not here to make you feel guilty. I am just here because it's like, I love my wife to death, but we're together all the time. That love can grow kind of into cruise control instead of going into upper level the way it needs to be. And it can be that way with God. I'm in cruise control with God. I'm in cruise control with God. I'm just living this thing out. And God is saying, listen, look at your nation. Look at around us. We can say, oh, this room is full of people. But let me tell you, there's a difference between having a crowd and having a hungry group of people after God. I've heard it said over and over again that the situation of this current election is a reflection of our culture. And I'm not going to go into the depths of that, but you know what I'm saying is that if the reflection of this election is a picture of our culture is in desperate need of revival. And so we're saying, God, can this happen? And you're thinking, well, man, that remnant needs to crank up. Well, y'all know the way I'm wired is why not here? Why can we not get this hunger for God? God, we're coming around your table today. We want to be your people. We want to pursue you with our full hearts. Now, here's what I'm going to ask of you over the next couple of minutes. Brett, y'all come on back up. We're going to take an opportunity just for you. Hopefully, if you knew we were coming today, I think some people probably say, I'm not coming today. I've literally had some people say, I do not come on the day we do the Lord's Supper because I know you're going to say we need to get our relationships right, and I don't want to get a relationship right. I've literally had people tell me that. And I'm thinking, my goodness, who would want to live life that way? And so today I'm going to ask this of you. You know, every generation has its prophets, right? I mean, those people that speak into that culture and make waves into that culture. Some people would jokingly say the Beatles were a prophetic voice to that culture and that kind of stuff. I don't know about that. I Want to Hold Your Hand didn't do anything for me back in that day. I don't know if that's a prophetic word. But, you know, people speak up and they speak into cultures. I was very beneficial that in my upbringing, I was got to be a part on the latter end of what's called the Jesus movement. I came to Christ out of that. I was very blessed. And there was a guy that was a prophetic voice in my life during that time. His name was Keith Green. Keith Green actually died in an airplane accident at the age of 28. And he was a young guy. And so he's been dead longer than he was here. But I still listen to his stuff. You listen to my playlist, there's going to be Keith Green because so many of his songs, when I'm out walking, his songs will just penetrate. Because they weren't just songs of fluff. They weren't just songs about, Jesus, I love you. They were songs about penetrating who we were and where we walk with the Lord. And I wanted to just share with you the lyrics. And this is one of my favorite. I can pull up some others that are favorites. But Keith Green wrote a song called My Eyes Are Dry. And understand, this is a guy in his 20s that is writing this. He said this, my eyes are dry, my faith is old, my heart is hard, my prayers are cold. And I know how I ought to be, alive to you and dead to me. But what can be done for an old heart like mine? Soften it up with oil and wine. The oil is you, your spirit of love. Please wash me anew with the wine of your blood. I'm thinking, man, and those lyrics just come back to my mind because so often, listen, I jokingly say this, I get paid to be good. I mean, I am your pastor. There's expectations you have of me to be this way, but I'm telling you, there are times when I'm just crying, God, my eyes are dry. My faith has grown old somewhere. And Lord, I just need you to come and blow a fresh wind upon me. And I'm not talking about just zeal. Listen, I am old enough and experienced enough to know that zeal will pass away. I'm talking about a deep-rooted, face-to-face, God, we need you kind of encounter. So I want you to stand with me. And here's the deal. You're going to deal with God right where you're at. But these stairs, I love altar experience. Y'all know me. I love the altar. Maybe some of you just want to say, God, you know, my faith has grown cold. And Lord, I'm praying. I want to be part of that remnant that's crying out to you. Lord, today we come to seek your face, not your hands. God, we're not here to say, oh, bring healing to so-and-so out there. God, we're asking you just to come. Lord, to shake us, to wake us, to Lord, just just to stir us out of an apathy. And God, if anything, if this election proves anything, maybe it's time for your church just to awaken and to pray and say, God bless America. God, we need you in our country. We need revival across the land. God, begin with me. Begin right here with me. Lord, begin on this Sunday as we take the Lord's Supper. Lord, just prepare my heart. Prepare my heart. These steps are open, people. If you need to grab somebody by the hand, say, hey, just go pray with me. Do you mind? Just come on. Brett and the team are going to lead us in a song that's going to lead our hearts. But right now, you just deal with the Lord right where you're at.